The mud was alive that night. It pulled at her boots with every step like something beneath the earth had decided she didn't deserve to leave. The sleet came sideways, finding every gap in her coat, every inch of skin she couldn't protect. And beside her, her grandmother Agnes moved like a woman held together by nothing but will, each breath ending in a cough that sounded like something tearing loose inside her chest. Mara Calloway was 17 years old. She had one burlap sack, one axe, one wool blanket that smelled of cedar and old age, and a dog named Copper who pressed against her leg as if he understood that warmth was the only thing left worth sharing. 2 hours ago she had a home. Now she had a December night, a dying old woman on her arm, and the memory of a door clicking shut behind her, the sound of a sentence being finished by someone who'd decided her story was already over. The preacher had looked at her grandmother coughing in the rain and closed his door anyway. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. Mara didn't survive what came next because she was exceptional. She survived because her father, a quiet man who loved problems more than he loved people, had once taken her to a waterfall and told her to listen. "The sound is wrong," he said. "It's hollow." She didn't understand it then. She was about to. The mud was alive that night. It pulled at her boots with every step, like something beneath the earth had decided she didn't deserve to leave. The sleet came sideways, finding every gap in her worn coat, every inch of exposed skin she couldn't protect. The temperature had been dropping since midday, and now, at whatever hour this was, somewhere between 10 at night and the end of everything, the cold had stopped being something that touched her from the outside and had become something that lived inside her bones, slow and patient and certain. Beside her, Agnes moved like a woman held together by nothing but the decision not to fall. She was 70 years old, and she had been coughing since September, a dry, rasping sound that had become so familiar in the kitchen that Mara had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock on the wall. But out here in the dark, in the sleet, with no walls to absorb it, each cough sounded like something tearing loose inside the old woman's chest, something that had held for a long time and was running out of reasons to keep holding. Mara had her arm around her grandmother's shoulders. She had pulled her own coat half open and was using her body to block the wind from Agnes's face. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. But it was everything she had, and so she did it anyway. The dog stayed close. Copper was 3 years old, a rust-colored hound with brown eyes that reflected light even in complete darkness. He had not left Mara's side since the morning they buried Edmund Calloway on the hill above the East Field 11 months ago. He pressed against her leg now with a warmth that felt almost deliberate, as if he understood that heat was the only thing left worth sharing, and he was offering his. They had one burlap sack between them. Inside it, a short-handled axe with a hickory handle her father had shaped himself. A tinderbox of flint and steel wrapped in oilcloth. One wool blanket that smelled of cedar and thyme. A heel of bread already going soft in the wet. And beneath all of it, folded once and tucked against the axe handle, a piece of paper that Mara did not yet know existed. It was not much to show for 17 years of living. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back 2 hours, back to the kitchen, back to the moment the world broke. The Calloway farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road in the Appalachian highlands of Western Virginia, where the mountains rose like the spines of something ancient and half asleep, and the hollows between them held weather and secrets in equal measure. Edmund Calloway had built this house with his own hands 30 years ago, when timber was cheap and his back was young and his head was full of plans. He sketched on any flat surface he could find. He drew the angles of the roof on the backs of feed receipts. He calculated the pitch of drainage ditches in the margins of almanacs. He designed a chicken coop latch so precise that it kept foxes out for 6 consecutive months, when every wire solution before it had failed within a week. He was that kind of man, always reaching for a pencil before reaching for his supper, always seeing the problem inside the problem, always 3 steps ahead of whatever the land threw at him. Edmund Calloway had been dead for 11 months. Mara sat at the kitchen table that evening doing what her father had always done. She was drawing on the back of a torn calendar page December 1870, the dates already crossed off in her stepmother's careful hand, sketching a system of drainage channels for the East Field, the one that flooded every spring, the one that drowned the early corn and set the whole growing season back by 3 weeks. Her pencil lines were precise, annotated with angles and depth measurements. The work of a mind that could not stop solving problems even when there was no one left who wanted them solved. Agnes sat across from her, knitting a wool sock with fingers that moved from 40 years of memory rather than from sight. Her needles clicked in the quiet rhythm of something winding down. Between clicks, she coughed. At Mara's feet, Copper lay with his muzzle on his paws, his brown eyes following the pencil as it moved. The bedroom door opened. Harriet Calloway walked in. She was 41 years old, with a face that might have been handsome if it ever relaxed. She had married Edmund 14 months before his death, a practical arrangement as most people in the valley understood it, between a widower who needed help managing the farm and a woman from the next county who needed a place to stand. Whether love had entered the equation at any point was a question neither of them had ever answered out loud, and now only one of them was left to wonder about it. Harriet carried a small wooden chest. She set it on the table between the calendar page and the knitting needles. The chest contained Mara's 3 books, 2 spare dresses, a pair of worn gloves, and a brass compass that had belonged to Edmund, dented on one side from the time he had dropped it in the creek, and Mara, age 7, had waded in after it without being asked. Harriet looked at the calendar page, at the pencil lines, at Mara's hand still resting on the page as if it might continue the drawing on its own. She said, "The farm cannot carry dead weight." Her voice was flat, not loud, not sharp, not the voice of someone in the middle of deciding something. This was the voice of a decision made long before the words were spoken, the voice of a conclusion that had been sitting in a room by itself for weeks, waiting for someone to open the door and let it out. Mara looked up from her drawing. "You read books instead of mending fences. You sketch diagrams instead of weeding. You spent half a morning last spring engineering a new hinge for the barn door when the old one just needed tightening. The old hinge was cracked through the pin. It would have failed by summer. Your father is dead, Mara." Harriet's jaw tightened. "Sketches on paper do not replace a bag of corn, and I cannot afford to feed someone whose primary contribution to this household is knowing things nobody asked her to know." Agnes set down her needles. The clicking stopped. In the sudden silence, the sleet against the roof sounded very loud. Harriet turned to the old woman. "And you sit there and smile every time she wastes a day building something nobody asked for. You encourage it. You tell her she's clever and capable and her father would be proud, and meanwhile the firewood doesn't get split and the mending doesn't get done, and I am carrying this farm alone." Agnes said nothing. She looked at Mara. Her eyes said what her mouth did not. Mara stood. The chair scraped against the plank floor. "You cannot put us out in December. Agnes is sick. Listen to her cough. At least let us stay through winter. We'll go in the spring, I promise you. We'll go, and we won't ask for anything." Harriet looked at Mara for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something that did not look like cruelty exactly, but something worse in its own way. The expression of a person looking at a wound they have been pressing on for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter than anything she had said before. "You look just like him." Mara said nothing. "The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. The way you squint at things like the whole world is a puzzle that owes you a solution. Harriet's hands pressed flat on the table had begun to tremble. I married Edmund Calloway because I wanted a stable life, a farm, a family, something real I could stand on. She stopped, drew a breath. But Edmund was never really here. His mind was always somewhere else, in his plans, in his diagrams, in whatever problem he'd found that was more interesting than the person sitting across the table from him. The sleet hit the windows. He was kind to me, he was decent, he never raised his voice, and he never raised his hand, and by every measure of what a good man is supposed to be, he qualified. Her voice cracked at the edges. But he never looked at me the way he looked at a problem he was solving. I was his wife, but I was never as interesting to him as a drainage ditch or a better hinge. She pushed the wooden chest toward Mara. And then he died. And there you were, tilting your head the same way, drawing on the same surfaces. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. I saw the man who was kind to me but never truly saw me. And I cannot. She stopped. I cannot do it anymore. She reached beneath the table and lifted the burlap sack. She set it beside the chest. Take what you need. The axe, the tinderbox, one blanket. It was Agnes who stood first. She placed one hand on the table to steady herself, gathered her knitting into the sack with quiet, unhurried movements, and did not look at Harriet. She looked at Mara, and in that look was everything a person can say without using words. We are leaving now. Stand up straight. Do not beg. Mara picked up the sack. She picked up the compass from the chest and put it in her coat pocket. She left everything else. They walked through the front room past the chair where Edmund used to sit in the evenings reading aloud from a battered copy of Franklin's autobiography, his voice slow and comfortable, his free hand absently scratching Copper's ears. Past the shelf where his survey tools were still arranged in the order he had left them. Out the front door and into the sleet. The latch clicked shut behind them. The sound was very small in the storm, but Mara heard it clearly. The way you hear the last word of a sentence that has been a long time coming. She did not turn toward the valley road. The valley road led down and away toward towns and strangers and problems she had no way to solve tonight. Instead, she turned right toward the one house in the settlement that was supposed to mean something. The one with the light always burning. The one whose occupant had stood at the front of the church every Sunday for 30 years and told 43 families that God looked after those who looked after each other. Reverend Gideon Holt's house was the largest in the settlement. 2 stories of white clapboards set beside the small church, warm light visible through the parlor windows even at this hour. A decent man's house. A house that looked from the outside like the kind of place where a door might open. Mara knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. She knocked again harder, her knuckles already going numb. Copper pressed against her leg, shivering. The door opened. Holt stood in the frame, and behind him was everything the night was not. Firelight, the smell of pipe tobacco and beeswax candles, the particular warmth of a room where someone has been comfortable for hours. The heat that reached through the open door felt like a physical thing, like a hand extended briefly before being withdrawn. He was 58, thin as a fence post, with the long, practiced gravity of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most certain person in any room he entered. Reverend Holt. Mara spoke fast because Agnes was shivering against her side, and every second in this sleet was a second that cost them something. Harriet Calloway has put us out. My grandmother is sick, you can hear her cough, and we have nowhere to go tonight. We don't need much. Just the church. Just a roof until the weather breaks. Holt looked past Mara at Agnes. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. The old woman stood hunched in the downpour, her white hair plastered flat, her thin coat soaked through to the skin. Her breath came in short, visible clouds that the wind snatched away immediately. Then he looked back at Mara. "Coraline Harriet is the legal owner of that property," he said. "Family matters are not something I can interfere in, Lenora. It wouldn't be appropriate." "My name is Mara, and I'm not asking you to interfere with a property deed. I'm asking you to let a 70-year-old woman who is coughing blood sleep under a roof tonight." Something moved in Holt's face. A calculation. The kind that happens very fast in people who have had long practice at it. If I open the church to every family, in difficult circumstances, it becomes something other than a church. Winter is hard for everyone in this valley, Mara. I cannot set a precedent that... Agnes's hand found Mara's arm. She tugged gently. "The way you touch someone when you want to redirect them without making a scene." "Come, child," Agnes said. Her voice was so quiet that the sleet almost took it entirely. "Don't ask a man who has already decided." Mara looked at Holt one more time. She saw it clearly. The calculation behind his eyes, the quick, cold arithmetic of a man weighing the cost of compassion against the cost of inconvenience, and finding that compassion came out short. She had seen that look before on men who were perfectly decent in situations that cost them nothing. Before the door closed fully, she heard him speak not to her, but to someone inside, to his wife in the quieter voice men use when they think they are no longer being heard. "Edmund Calloway built things that lasted. His daughter won't." The door shut. Mara stood in the sleet and let those words go through her completely. Not like a blow, like a temperature, something she registered and filed away in a place where things that matter get stored. He was not just refusing to help her, he was competing with her dead father. She turned away. She and Agnes walked back into the storm. They passed the Crutchfield house on the way to the forest road. A curtain moved in the downstairs window, a pale rectangle of interior light briefly interrupted by a shape, then falling back into place. Someone watching. Someone who had seen two women in the sleet and made a decision about it that involved closing a curtain rather than opening a door. Copper growled low and confused. Even the dog understood that doors were supposed to open. The road dissolved into a track of wet clay and stone within the first mile. After the second mile, it was not a road at all, just a gap between the trees where the undergrowth was thinner and the mud was darker. The sleet hardened into something that stung every piece of exposed skin and found every gap in every layer of clothing. Agnes stumbled. Her foot caught a root hidden under the mud, and she went forward, and only Mara's grip on her arm kept her from going down face first. The impact jarred a cough out of her that sounded like something structural giving way, not the familiar dry rasp of the kitchen, but something deeper and wetter, and much more frightening. "Just a little farther," Mara said. Her voice was level. She would not let fear into her voice. "Just keep walking with me." She pulled the blanket from the sack and wrapped it around Agnes's shoulders, tucking the edges under her chin. It was a gesture that felt miserably inadequate, one wool blanket against a December night in the Appalachians. But she did it anyway because it was what she had, and doing nothing was not something she was built for. The cold had stopped being a surface thing. It was inside them now. A deep, invasive chill that settled into the joints and the spaces between thoughts, making everything slower, making the mind reach for simpler and simpler solutions. And in that reaching, something surfaced. Not a thought exactly, more like a sensation. The feeling of warm sun on river water, the sound of something enormous. She was 9 years old, and it was a summer day so bright it made the creek water look like hammered silver, and her father had taken her somewhere she had never been before. Edmund had put his hand on her shoulder and leaned close to her ear, and she remembered the particular quality of his voice in that moment. Not the voice he used for problems or plans or explaining things, but the voice he used when he had found something wonderful and was about to share it. "Listen carefully, Mara. The sound is wrong. Do you hear it? It's hollow." She had listened. She had heard only the roar of falling water, the crash of it on the rocks below, the hiss of mist rising. She had looked up at his face and seen him smiling, and she had smiled too, because his delight was contagious even when she didn't understand its source. "Hollow," he had said again, and laughed, and taken her hand and led her back downstream. She had forgotten about it the way children forget things that don't yet have a place in their understanding. She remembered it now, a hollow sound, wrong because there was space behind it, an emptiness where solid rock should have been, a place behind the water, a place you couldn't see until you knew how to listen for it. Millstone Falls. It was 2 miles upstream, maybe 2.5 in this dark and this weather. She wasn't certain she remembered exactly where. She wasn't certain the place her 9-year-old mind had recorded was real, and not a child's embellishment memory polished by years into something more useful than it actually was. But it was the only destination she had, and the alternative was to keep walking into the dark until Agnes couldn't walk anymore, and that would be the end of both of them. She shifted her grip on Agnes's arm, taking more of the old woman's weight onto her shoulder, and changed direction, uphill, toward the sound of water she couldn't hear yet but believed was there. Somewhere behind the noise, somewhere behind the wall. Copper pressed against her leg and matched her pace without being asked. They heard the falls before they saw them. The roar grew from a distant murmur to a presence that vibrated through the soles of their boots and up into their teeth. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the water, Mara's heart dropped. This was not the summer falls of her memory. Elk Creek, Millstone Creek, was a different creature in December after 2 days of sleet. It had overrun its banks and spread wide, brown, and furious, moving with a speed that tore saplings from the soil and rolled stones the size of skulls downstream like marbles. The falls themselves were a solid curtain of white violence, 6 feet wide and 20 feet high, crashing onto the rocks below with a force that sent mist billowing outward in all directions. The mist hit their faces like a slap. Agnes sagged. Her knees buckled, and Mara caught her with both arms, holding the old woman upright by force against the weight of everything the night had been. "Mara," Agnes's voice was nearly gone. "There's nothing here. There's only—" "There is." Mara's eyes were fixed on the base of the falls. She was reading the rock face the way her father had taught her to read everything, looking for the thing beneath the surface, the truth the surface was trying to hide. "There is something. Look at the base. The rock is undercut. There's a curve there. Do you see it? Where the stone goes back." Agnes looked. Mara didn't wait for confirmation. She couldn't. If she waited, she would think too carefully about what she was about to do, and thinking too carefully about it would stop her. She guided Agnes toward the edge of the falls, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She found a handhold on the slick, mossy rock face, an edge, a lip, something to grip, and sidled along it, pulling Agnes behind her, their feet sliding on stone coated in algae and rushing water. The spray was blinding. It soaked them instantly. Cold so intense it felt like burning. Copper hesitated at the edge, whimpered once, and then followed. Mara took the deepest breath of her life and stepped through. For a moment there was nothing but chaos. Cold and pressure and darkness and noise, the full weight of Millstone Falls coming down on her shoulders, driving her to her knees on the rock below. Water filled her nose and mouth. She could not breathe. She could not see. She could feel Agnes's hand in hers, gripping with a strength that seemed impossible for fingers that thin, and she held on and pushed forward. 1 step, 2 steps. Her boots scraped on something solid beneath the water, and then she was through. She stumbled forward onto a wide, dry ledge of rock and fell to her hands and knees, gasping. The noise dropped as if someone had closed a massive door. Not gone, but contained, muffled, transformed from something that battered her into something that simply surrounded her. The air was still. Cold, yes, but still. Free of the wind and the sleet and the hammering weight of open December. She turned and reached back through the curtain, found Agnes's hand, pulled. Agnes came through like a woman being born a second time, stumbling, choking, collapsing onto the stone beside her granddaughter. Copper scrambled through after them, shaking so hard the water flew from his coat in arcs, and then pressed himself against Mara's side with a full-body shudder that was as close to relief as a dog can express. They lay there together on the stone ledge for a long time. When Mara finally raised her head and looked around, she understood that the memory had not lied. The cave was vast. The ledge extended back into a space so large that its ceiling disappeared into shadow. The walls rose smooth and dark on either side, carved by water and time into shapes that seemed almost intentional, as if something patient had been working here for longer than anyone could reasonably count. Light filtered through the curtain of water behind them, casting a shifting green glow across the stone, a light that moved and danced and painted living patterns on every surface, real, solid, dry. And the roar of the falls, which had been deafening outside, was here a muted, distant thunder, the sound of a storm safely on the other side of a door. Agnes coughed. It echoed off the stone walls and came back to them multiplied, and Mara winced at the sound of it. But Agnes was breathing. They both were. "Fire," Agnes whispered. In the stillness of the cave, even a whisper carried. "Mara, we need fire before this cold sets into the bone for good." Mara rose on shaking legs and explored. The cave extended back roughly 50 feet before narrowing into a passage too small to stand in. The floor was dry and uneven, but solid, free of the standing water she had feared. And near the back wall, where the ceiling came down to meet the narrowing walls, she felt it, a faint draft, a whisper of air movement pulling upward. She looked and found it a dark fissure running up through the rock and disappearing into blackness above. A natural chimney. She moved deeper into the cave, feeling along the walls in the darkness. Her fingers found what she was looking for. Bits of wood, branches, and bark fragments that had been washed in by some ancient flood and left in the still, dry air for years, maybe decades. She gathered everything she could carry. With fingers so numb she could barely feel the flint and steel, she struck sparks into a nest of dried moss. The sparks fell, died. She struck again, again. A fourth time, a fifth. Her hands shaking, her teeth clenched until a tiny ember glowed orange in the darkness. She cupped it, breathed on it, the breath of someone trying to coax something fragile back from the edge. The flame caught. It grew. It steadied. She fed it carefully, slivers of wood no thicker than matchsticks, then larger pieces building a pyramid around the core. Within minutes, a real fire was burning in the center of the cave, its light pushing back the shadows, its warmth reaching outward like open hands. The smoke rose thin and straight, drawn upward by the draft from the fissure above. It worked. Agnes crawled to the fire. Her face in the firelight was gaunt and gray, but her eyes were bright with something that had no name for it, except endurance. She looked at the fire for a long time. Then she looked at Mara. "Edmund would be proud," she said quietly. Mara did not answer. She sat cross-legged beside the fire, her wet clothes beginning to steam at the edges, and she stared into the flame. And for the first time since the kitchen door had clicked shut behind them, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not the dramatic collapsing grief of someone who has given up, just tears running silent down cheeks that were already wet, falling onto hands that were already cold. Grief and fury and relief and fear all pressed together into something that had no clean name. Agnes said nothing. She reached across and placed her hand on Mara's head. Her fingers rested lightly on the wet hair, and she let the girl cry until the crying was finished. Copper curled between them, his warm body touching them both, his brown eyes reflecting the firelight as he kept watch over the only two people in his world. Later, much later, when the fire had settled into a steady burn and Agnes had fallen into the first real sleep she'd had in days, Mara opened the burlap sack to take inventory of what they had. The axe, the tinder box, the blanket almost dry now, the heel of bread ruined, a ball of wool Agnes had tucked in without being asked, and at the very bottom, folded once and tucked against the axe handle, a piece of paper she didn't recognize. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting stopped her breath. She had grown up watching that handwriting on feed receipts and almanac margins and every flat surface her father could find. She would have known it anywhere. It was Edmund's hand. The page showed a sketch rough but precise in the way all of Edmund's sketches were of a rock formation. A waterfall, a cave behind it with dimensions noted in the margins, arrows indicating the chimney draft, a notation about the depth of the dry ledge, and at the bottom in her father's careful block letters, our insurance policy. Tell Mara when she's ready, she'll hear it before she sees it. Mara read it 3 times. She looked at Agnes asleep by the fire. The old woman's face was peaceful in the firelight, more peaceful than Mara had seen it in months. She had known. She had been carrying this paper for nearly a year, tucked into the bottom of her bag, waiting for the night it would be needed, waiting for Mara to be ready. Edmund had known about this place. He had found it, surveyed it, mapped it, made notes in the margin about its structural properties. He had prepared it as a last resort, an insurance against the kind of catastrophe that proud, capable men secretly plan for while telling everyone else that everything is fine. And then he had died before he could explain it to his daughter directly. So he had told Agnes, and Agnes had carried it. And on a December night in 1870, with the sleet coming down and the door of every house in the settlement closed against them, the paper had found its moment. Mara folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket against her chest. She sat by the fire for a long time after that, listening to the falls on the other side of the water wall. The sound was different in here. It was still enormous. You could feel it in the stone beneath you, but it had lost its violence. It had become something else. A boundary, a threshold, a door that opened from the inside. She thought about Edmund sketching this cave on the back of some receipt or letter, measuring the ledge with his hands, noting the chimney draft with the same focus he gave every problem worth solving. She thought about him deciding not to tell her directly, deciding instead to leave it with Agnes, trusting the old woman's judgment about when the right moment would be. She thought about what it meant to leave something behind for someone you loved. Not money, not land, not a name written on a deed, just a piece of paper. A sketch of a hollow in the rock. A hiding place for the worst night. She did not know yet about the full weight of what her father had left behind. She did not know that Edmund's surveys of this land extended far beyond one cave behind one waterfall. She did not know that a copy of those surveys existed in the county land office in Lewisburg, and that a man named Dale Varner had recently found it, and that he was already beginning to follow the lines Edmund had drawn toward this hillside. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only that the fire was warm, that Agnes was breathing, that Copper's heartbeat was steady against her leg, and that somewhere behind the sound of falling water, her father had left her a door. She was inside it. She was alive. Agnes stirred once in her sleep and spoke a single word, not Mara's name, and not Edmund's, a name Mara had never heard before. Louisa. Mara looked at her grandmother's sleeping face, at the lines that years and grief and the determined accumulation of knowledge had pressed into it. She filed the name away in the same place she had filed Holt's words through the closing door, in the place where things that matter get stored, waiting for the moment when you are finally ready to understand them. She added another piece of wood to the fire. The flames rose. The falls roared on the other side of the water wall, constant and patient, the same sound they had made for 10,000 years before this night, and would make for 10,000 years after it. Mara Calloway pulled her knees to her chest, put her back against the cave wall, and looked at the fire. She had one axe, one tinderbox, a handful of dry wood, and a dog, and a sleeping old woman, and a piece of paper her dead father had left her. She had 17 years of watching a man solve problems by refusing to accept that they couldn't be solved. Outside, December continued its work. In here, the fire burned, and Mara Calloway began very quietly to think. The first morning inside the cave, Mara woke before dawn to the sound of Agnes coughing, and the fire reduced to a cluster of red coals barely larger than her fist. She did not lie there thinking about it. She got up, fed the fire, and began. That was how the days started from that point forward. Not with planning, not with the luxury of deciding what kind of day it would be. Just the immediate hierarchy of needs arranged in order of urgency: fire, water, warmth, food, and the body moving through them before the mind had fully caught up. There was something clarifying about it, something that stripped away everything that wasn't load-bearing and left only what mattered. Edmund had taught her that without ever saying it directly, the way he moved through problems, not around them, not above them, but straight through the center, one thing at a time in the right order. She understood it better now than she ever had in the farmhouse kitchen watching him work. January came in hard. The temperature outside dropped low enough that the spray from the falls froze on the outer rocks in overnight, coating the stone entrance in a layer of pale ice that caught the thin winter light and refracted it into the cave in broken colors. Mara spent the first 2 weeks of January doing 3 things keeping Agnes alive: keeping the fire burning and exploring every inch of the cave with the systematic attention her father would have given it. The chimney draft was reliable. That was the first good thing. The fissure in the back wall pulled smoke upward cleanly and consistently, which meant a fire could burn indefinitely without filling the space with smoke. This was not a small thing. This was, in fact, the thing that made everything else possible. The floor of the main chamber was dry stone, uneven but solid. The cave extended roughly 50 feet from the fall's curtain to the point where it narrowed into a passage too tight for a grown person to stand in. The walls were smooth and dark, carved by water over time, into shapes that were almost architectural curves and overhangs and flat sections that seemed to have been designed for purpose. Against the back wall, where the stone was driest and the residual heat from the fire pit would radiate most effectively, Mara made her decision. She would build a cabin inside the cave, not a shelter, not a temporary arrangement, a cabin, 4 walls, a raised floor, a door that closed, a box inside a box, wood within stone, something that could hold heat the way a hand cups a flame. She told Agnes the plan that evening. Agnes looked at the back wall for a long moment, then she said, "Do you know how to notch logs so they lock together without nails?" Mara shook her head. "Then bring me wood," Agnes said, "and I'll teach you." The work began in the dark hours before dawn, because that was when Mara moved through the world outside the cave. She had established this rule for herself in the first week, and she held to it without exception. Before first light, when the air was too dim for anyone to see clearly, and the dew was still heavy enough to wash footprints from soft ground within minutes, she moved through the creek whenever the terrain allowed it, the cold water numbing her feet to the ankle, but leaving no trace on the rocky bed. She never felled a standing tree. She took only what had already fallen, selecting timber from a wide enough area that no single spot showed too much disturbance. She went in and out of the cave exclusively through the waterfall. Every single time, no matter the weather, no matter how tired she was, no matter how much the cold of that curtain of water hit her like a physical blow, the alternative was footprints on the dry rock outside, footprints that could be followed. And so she endured the daily shock of the falls, gasping through it, pushing through it, coming out the other side into the warmth of the cave's fire-heated air. Copper learned to follow without complaint. On the other side, he would shake himself with tremendous theatrical energy, spraying Mara with water in arcs, and then look at her with an expression of complete self-satisfaction, as if he had accomplished something remarkable and expected to be recognized for it. It made her laugh every time. That surprised her, that she could still laugh, that there was still room for it somewhere in the middle of all this. The first log was the hardest lesson. Agnes directed from her place by the fire, drawing shapes in the dirt floor, with a stick explaining the geometry of the curved notch that needed to be cut in the underside of each log so it would seat snugly over the one below it, locking tight under its own weight. No nails, no rope, just wood fitting against wood in the right shape, gravity doing the rest. Mara's first attempts were bad. The fit was loose enough to slide 2 fingers through the gap, which meant cold air and heat loss and a structure that would shift over time. She adjusted her angle. She learned to read the grain of the wood, to feel where it wanted to split cleanly, and where it would tear where the axe should go and where it shouldn't. Her hands developed calluses over the calluses she already had. By the 5th log, the joints were tighter. By the 10th, they were clean. By the 15th, she was cutting them on instinct. The worst moment came on a gray Tuesday morning in early February. She had been working for 2 hours to bring a particularly dense section of white oak up a 40-foot slope, a piece that must have weighed twice what she did. Rolled and levered and wrestled uphill, by increments, her shoulders burning the small of her back, sending up a steady signal of protest that she was choosing to ignore. She was 10 feet from the top of the rise when her left foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves and the log rolled. It gathered speed going down the slope. 4 seconds. Everything she had spent 2 hours doing undone in 4 seconds. The log came to rest exactly where it had started. Mara stood in the mud at the bottom of the slope and looked at it. Something came out of her that was not a word and not a cry, a raw guttural sound aimed at the gray sky and the indifferent trees and the whole blind, stupid weight of the physical world. It left her throat and bounced off the ridge above and came back diminished, and she listened to it die. Then she picked up the axe and started again. She did not cry. That was finished. Whatever crying needed to happen had happened on the first night by the fire, and she had let it be complete. And now there was only the log and the slope in the morning. By mid-February, 4 walls stood at the back of the cave. Rough and thick, the logs notched tight, the gaps between them packed with creek bank clay and dried moss that Mara pressed in with her fingers until the walls were as airtight as she could make them. The raised sleeping platform came next to bunk boards, supported by notched uprights, lifting them off the cold stone floor. A split log table. 2 stools. The cabin was 8 feet by 8 feet. It was ugly in the way that things built under pressure and with limited tools are always ugly, functional, imperfect, real. When Mara closed the door for the first time and stood inside and felt the temperature climb as the small interior space held the heat, Her body was generating. She put her back against the wall and slid down to the floor and sat there with the most foolish grin she had worn since she was 9 years old at the edge of a waterfall. Copper jumped into her lap and licked her face. Agnes stood in the doorway looking at her granddaughter's face and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The silent trade with Silas Pruitt began in February. Mara had spotted him first, a distant figure leading a mule along the faint trail that ran on the far side of the creek, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had walked this route so many times. His feet knew it independently of his mind. She had pulled back into the trees fast, but not fast enough. Silas Pruitt had seen the movement. He had noted it, and continued on his way. He was 52 years old, lean as winter timber with pale gray eyes that registered everything they rested on, and a mouth that spent those observations frugally. He had been running this trading route, farmstead to farmstead, settlement to Lewisburg, and back again for 12 years. He knew every dog that would bark and every dog that wouldn't. He knew every family, every child, every widow who needed help, and every man who pretended he didn't. He knew when something new appeared in his territory. 3 weeks after she first saw him, Mara left 3 clay pots on a flat rock near the trail. She'd been working with clay for 6 weeks by that point, Agnes teaching her the pinch method, starting with a ball of dense gray clay from the creek bank, pressing a thumb into the center, slowly widening the opening while thinning the walls, rotating the piece in her palm. The first bowl had been lopsided and too thick on one side. The second was better. By the 5th, her hands had found the rhythm of it. She left the 3 best pots on the rock and retreated into the trees to watch. Copper stayed beside her, trained now to silence when silence was needed. Silas stopped his mule at the rock. He walked over and picked up each pot in turn, giving each one the slow, thorough attention of a man who handles goods for a living. He turned them over. He checked the wall thickness. He tapped them with his knuckle and listened to the sound of the clean ceramic ring of properly fired clay. He set them down, reached into a pack on his mule, placed a small burlap pouch on the rock in their stead, and led his mule away without looking back. Inside the pouch, salt, dried beans, and a whetstone for her axe. The trade continued through February and into March. Pottery for provisions, flour, lard rope, once a needle and thread that Agnes received with the reverence of someone accepting something sacred. Neither of them spoke during these exchanges. Neither of them needed to. The terms were fair, and fairness between people who live close to necessity is its own complete language. Then on a morning in early March, Mara found something tucked inside a sack of cornmeal. A piece of paper torn from a larger sheet. The writing cramped and tilted in the hand of a man who wrote rarely, and with effort. Someone asking about your pots. Name of Varner. He's not after clay alone. Be careful. Mara met Silas at the trading rock 3 days later. She stood in the open for the first time in full daylight and waited. Copper sat beside her. When Silas came around the bend with his mule, he saw her and did not slow his pace and did not change his expression. He simply walked up to the rock, tied the mule to a branch, and looked at her with those pale creek water eyes. "Tell me about Varner," Mara said. Silas took his time. He had the habit of a man who has learned that silence before speaking costs nothing and saves a great deal. Dale Varner was 45 years old, Silas said. He ran a homestead on the south fork of Millstone Creek, 3 miles downstream from where they were standing. He had a wife who was sick, had been sick since the summer, and a daughter named Rowena, 16 years old. He had borrowed heavily from a creditor in Lewisburg 2 years ago to buy equipment and seed after a bad harvest, and the debt was now past due. If he couldn't produce a significant sum before spring of 1872, he would lose the homestead. He had convinced himself there was a kaolin deposit somewhere on the upper creek. White clay, the kind that the pottery manufacturers in Wheeling paid serious money for. He had been asking at every farmstead on Silas's route whether anyone had seen signs of clay workings, anyone producing pottery, anyone living rough in the upper territory. And then Silas paused. Mara watched his face. She had learned in these past weeks of silent trade to read what Silas Pruitt's face did when he was deciding how much of something to share. "What else?" she said. Silas looked at the creek, at the far tree line, at the mule. "Varner found something at the county land office in Lewisburg," he said. "Survey records, old ones filed about 5 years back for this section of the upper creek." He looked at Mara. The name on the filing was Edmund Calloway. The world did not shift. The trees did not move. The creek kept running, but something inside Mara's chest went very still. "My father surveyed this land. Filed the paperwork in 65. Covered the whole upper section, the ridge line, the creek, bends, the falls. Very detailed work." Silas's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were watching her carefully. "Varner got a copy of the survey. He's been using it to map his search. It shows the cave." Mara said nothing. "He doesn't know anyone is living in it. He hasn't connected your pots to the survey location, but he's methodical and he's motivated by debt, which makes a man more methodical than he'd otherwise be." Silas paused. "I'd say you have 3 weeks, maybe 4 if he takes a wrong turn somewhere." Edmund had surveyed this land, had mapped it, had documented it, had filed the records with the county, all of it 6 years before his death. All of it in the same careful hand that had sketched the cave on the paper Agnes had kept for a year in the bottom of her bag. He had known this territory completely. He had prepared for things he hoped would never be necessary. And now a man was following his maps toward the home his daughter had built inside his insurance policy. Mara thanked Silas and walked back toward the falls. She did not speak for the rest of the day. She split firewood until her shoulders gave out, and then she sat by the fire and stared into it while Agnes watched her from the sleeping platform with the patient attention of someone waiting for a fever to break. That night, she became a ghost. She had been careful before. Now she was invisible. She moved only in the hour before dawn. She never left tracks on forest soil if she could help it, walking on stone and root and in the creek itself. She ranged wider for her timber never disturbing any single area enough to draw attention. She checked the area around the falls each morning for signs of approach. Boot prints, disturbed brush, fresh-cut marks on trees. Dale Varner did not appear. But his presence was already in the territory like a weather system, moving toward them from the south. It was Rowena Varner who appeared first. A Tuesday morning in mid-March, Mara was gathering wild onions from the creek bank, moving low and quiet, when she heard footsteps that were wrong, too light, too quick. The sound of someone moving with the nervous speed of a person who didn't want to be missed. She went flat behind a deadfall. Copper crouched beside her, tense and silent. A girl came through the rhododendron on the far bank. 16 years old, auburn hair in a braid that had mostly come undone. A cotton dress that was not warm enough for the weather. She was moving with her eyes down, pulling plants from the muddy bank and pushing them into a cloth sack. Mara recognized the leaves. Bone set, a fever remedy. Agnes had taught her to identify it in the first week. The girl looked up and their eyes met across the water. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She went completely still for 1 second, and then something moved across her face that wasn't recognition of Mara specifically. It was recognition of what Mara must be. The ghost, the trespasser, the person her father had been hunting. There was a bruise on the girl's left forearm.
the size and shape of 4 fingers and a thumb pressed into the flesh hard enough to leave a mark that was still visible days after the fact.
"You're the one making the clay pots," Rowena said. Not a question. Mara came out from behind the deadfall. She crossed the creek in 4 steps, the water cold through her boots. She stopped 6 feet from the girl and looked at her the way her father had taught her to look at things she was trying to understand directly without assumption, letting the information come to her rather than projecting onto it. The girl held her ground. "My name is Rowena Varner," she said. "My father is the one looking for you." The bruise, the thin dress, the way she kept glancing back over her shoulder, not the reflex of a trap setter checking that her target was positioned, but the reflex of someone who had spent years checking for following shadows. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. Rowena looked down at the bone set in her sack, at her own hands, at the water running between the stones of the creek bed. "My mother has been running a fever for 3 weeks, she said. Silas Pruitt told me not directly, but I overheard that there's a woman living somewhere up the creek who knows about plants and medicines." She looked up, and I figured that anyone my father is afraid of might be worth knowing. Mara looked at her for a long moment, then she said, "What does your father know?" Rowena told her everything. The survey records from the land office, the copy Dale had made of Edmund's maps, his systematic elimination of the territory sector by sector, his current position in the search southwest of the falls, working his way northeast along the creek bends. His estimate, as Rowena had overheard it, muttered to himself over the maps spread across the kitchen table, that he would reach the Millstone Falls area within 3 to 4 weeks. She told it all plainly, without drama, with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had been listening carefully to things not meant for her ears for a very long time. Then she said, "I can lead him wrong. I know which ridges he hasn't checked yet. I can make him waste a week on the South Fork." "Why would you do that?" Rowena didn't answer immediately. She looked at the bruise on her own arm, not with self-pity, but with the clinical detachment of someone cataloging a fact. "Because some things aren't right," she said finally, "and I'm old enough to know the difference, even if I'm not always able to do anything about it." Mara studied her for another moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced a small clay bowl and a folded piece of cloth containing 3 dried herbs that Agnes had taught her to prepare into a fever tea. She placed them in Rowena's hands. Rowena held the bowl the way people hold things they didn't expect to be offered. "Come back when you need more," Mara said, "and thank you." Rowena nodded once. She turned and disappeared into the rhododendron the way she had come, moving quietly and fast, and within 30 seconds there was no sign she had ever been there. Mara stood at the creek bank alone, an alliance built on a clay bowl and a shared understanding of what it means to live in the shadow of a man who has decided the world owes him something. April arrived. The creek dropped slightly, the days lengthened. Mara began trading more actively with Silas. The quality of her pottery had improved to the point where he was actively seeking buyers on her behalf. Families in the next valley who needed cooking vessels and were willing to pay in goods she couldn't produce herself. 2 hens came back with him one afternoon, tucked in a crate on the mule's back, protesting the indignity of transport at considerable volume. 3 sheep arrived the following week, traded for her finest set of bulls. She built a small coop for the hens against the warm back wall of the cave. Copper immediately appointed himself their guardian, circling them with a seriousness that made Mara smile despite herself. The sheep grazed on a small patch of grass near the cave entrance. Copper herded them with a focus and professionalism that seemed excessive for 3 sheep, but she let him have it. Purpose is purpose. On a warm afternoon in June, Silas asked a question she had been half expecting. "I could sell your pottery to the families in the settlement," he said. "Demand is there. You'd triple your income." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Which families? He named 4. The Crutchfields were among them. "No," she said. "Not them. Not anyone from the settlement." Silas looked at her with those pale eyes. "The Potts don't know who buys them, Mara, but I know." She said it without heat, without the kind of anger that needs to make noise about itself. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather, something simply true that doesn't require argument. Silas did not push it. He gathered his packs, untied his mule, and headed back down the trail. That night, Agnes waited until Mara had banked the fire and pulled her blanket up. Then she spoke from her sleeping platform, and her voice was not the instructive, patient voice she used when teaching. It was sharp. It had edges. "What did you tell Silas today?" Mara told her. "You just let hatred make a choice for you." The fire was low, casting almost no light. Outside, the Falls continued their constant conversation with the stone. "They watched us walk into the rain, Agnes. They closed their curtains." "I know what they did. I was there." Agnes's voice was quiet but unrelenting. "And I am telling you that the day your anger decides who deserves what you make, you are not free. You are chained to every one of them. And that chain is heavier than any log you have dragged up that hill." She turned on her side, facing the wall. Mara lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. She knew Agnes was right. She knew it. The way you know a bruise is there before you touch it. A dull awareness that becomes sharp only when pressed directly. The anger was real, and it was justified, and it had kept her warm on nights when the fire was not enough. But Opal Agnes was pointing at what came after justified. What the anger became when you held it long enough. She was not ready to put it down yet, but she felt its weight differently now. August came in hot and still. The creek dropped to its lowest level since Mara had arrived. The falls thinned until she could see patches of dark rock through the curtain. For the first time, a strange sight after months of solid white water. Like watching something familiar reveal an aspect of itself it had been keeping private. The garden on the cliff ledge outside was flourishing. She had built 3 terrace plots retained by stacked stones, hauled rich forest soil up to the rocky shelf, bucket by bucket over the course of many weeks. Beans climbed the corn stalks. Potato greens pushed through the dark earth. It was relentless work to keep watered in the heat, but it was real food growing in real soil tended by her own hands. She was kneeling in the lowest terrace, working a patch of stubborn ground with her small shovel, when she heard Agnes call her name from inside the cave. The sound of it stopped her completely. In all the months since December, Agnes had called her name only twice in that particular tone. Not the instructive voice, not the conversational voice, but something stripped down and direct that meant the ordinary rules of the moment no longer applied. She went inside. Agnes was on the sleeping platform, and one look at her face was enough. The fever had come on fast, too fast. The kind of fever that doesn't ask permission, it simply arrives and makes itself at home, and by the time you recognize what it has already been there for hours. Agnes's skin was dry and blazing. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. She was trying to speak and producing only fragments. Mara spent the night beside her changing wet cloths, keeping water at her lips, stoking the fire to the precise temperature that Agnes had once told her was right for fever, warm enough to prevent chilling, not so hot as to drive the temperature further. She measured everything she knew against what she was seeing, and what she was seeing exceeded what she knew how to treat. By midnight, Agnes was delirious. Her eyes were open but fixed on something that existed only in the fever. She spoke in fragments, names, half-sentences, instructions addressed to people who were not in the room. "Louisa." Her voice was barely there. "Louisa, forgive me." Mara went very still. She had heard that name once before, the night they arrived, Agnes asleep by the first fire. She had filed it away. She had not yet opened the file. At 2 in the morning, Agnes stopped breathing. Not a gasp, not a rattle, a cessation. The chest simply did not rise again. The hand Mara was holding went slack. The word that came out of Mara was not a word exactly. It was the sound a person makes when they have nothing left to buffer the impact of something they cannot accept. She pressed her ear to Agnes's chest. Nothing. She rolled the old woman onto her back, placed both hands over her sternum, and pressed. She had no training. She had only a memory. A spring morning 6 years ago, her father kneeling over a newborn calf that had inhaled creek water, pressing its rib cage with rhythmic, patient force, counting under his breath until the water came up and the breathing started. She pressed. She counted. Her arms burned. Sweat ran into her eyes. 10 seconds. 20, 30. The longest 30 seconds of her life. Each one a separate and complete eternity. Each one the possible last moment of Agnes Calloway's presence in the world. Copper pawed at Agnes's hand, whimpering, trying to wake her the only way he knew. Agnes inhaled. It was a long, shredding gasp that arched her back off the platform and ended in a cough that left blood on Mara's hands. But it was air. It was breathing. It was Agnes coming back from wherever she had been. Mara held her and did not let go. For a very long time, she simply held her. She broke every rule the next morning. She went to the trading rock in full daylight and left the signal she and Silas had agreed on for emergencies, 3 stones stacked in a particular arrangement on the flat surface. Then she retreated to the trees and waited, exposed and watchful, checking over her shoulder at every sound. She waited 2 days. Silas came on the morning of the 3rd day around the bend with his mule, and his pack moving at his usual unhurried pace. But he was not alone. Behind him, at a distance of about 20 feet, the distance of a man who is following but does not want to appear to be following, came Reverend Gideon Holt. Mara saw him before he saw her. She had a moment to take him in his coat, his careful posture, the way he carried himself, even out here in the trees, with the practiced gravity of a man accustomed to being the most significant person in any room he entered. He was carrying something. A canvas bag, medium-sized, the kind used for medicines and provisions. Silas reached the rock. He looked into the trees where he knew Mara was without directly looking. A small acknowledgement. Mara stepped out. She watched Holt see her, the recognition moving across his face, first confusion, then understanding, then something that was neither comfortable nor simple. He had been following Silas, she understood immediately. Had been watching the trading road for weeks, suspicious of where goods were going, pursuing some notion of accounting for what he called the proper order of things. And now he was standing in the forest looking at the girl he had turned away from his door in December. He did not speak. He walked forward. He set the canvas bag on the flat rock beside the trading stone. He looked at Mara for one long moment, and whatever was in his face was not the practiced gravity of the pulpit. It was something rawer than that. Something a man carries when he has known for months that he did something he cannot undo, and the weight of it has been getting heavier, not lighter with time. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come without a word. Mara looked at the bag. Inside was willow bark, dried ginseng root, a tin of medicinal salve, a small bottle of something she identified by smell as a tincture of elderberry and wild garlic. Good medicine, the right medicine for what Agnes had. She looked at Silas. How long has he been carrying this? Silas adjusted the mule's pack strap with the unhurried attention he gave everything. Since the sermon, he said. 2 months. He started following my route about 6 weeks in. I think he was looking for a reason. He paused. Or looking for the right moment. couldn't quite figure out how to cross the water. He picked up his reins and turned back toward the trail. He knew what he did, Silas said without turning around. Some men, that's the hardest part. Not the doing, the knowing afterward. He led his mule away. Mara stood at the rock with the canvas bag in her hands. Gideon Holt had stood in a warm room in December and let an old woman cough in the sleet outside his door. He had preached a sermon the following Sunday that used Mara's suffering as a lesson in divine consequence. He had been wrong, and he had known he was wrong, and for 2 months he had carried a bag of medicine through the woods following a trading mule, trying to find a way to say it that didn't require him to say it out loud. Some men, that's the hardest part. She thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up the bag and walked back toward the falls. Agnes recovered slowly. 7 days of bitter medicines brewed in the clay pot, wet cloths changed every 2 hours through the nights, copper sleeping pressed against the old woman's side through every dark hour. On the 8th day, Agnes sat up on her own and asked for broth. On the 9th day, she was coherent enough to talk. Mara had been waiting. "Who is Louisa?" Agnes held the bowl of broth in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The green shifting light from the falls came through the cave entrance and moved across her face in slow patterns the way water moves over stone. "Your mother had a sister," Agnes said. Her voice was flat in the way voices become when the feeling beneath them is too large for inflection. 2 years younger than Sarah. Her name was Louisa. She stopped. She died in November of 1833. She was 3 years old. Mara waited. "Diphtheria. I thought it was a cold. By the time I understood what I was looking at, it was already past what I could do anything about." Agnes's hands tightened slightly on the bowl. "She died on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after I first noticed the fever. 4 days in which I might have done something different if I had known what I was looking at." She looked up at Mara. "That is why I learned everything I could learn. Plants, medicines, building, pottery. Anything that could be made or fixed or grown with my own hands. Because the one time it mattered most, I was useless. And I decided I would never be useless again." The falls continued their endless work on the other side of the water wall. "And that is why I will not let anything happen to you," Agnes said quietly. "Because I have already lost one child to my own ignorance. I will not lose another." Mara sat with this. She looked at her grandmother not the way she had looked at her before, as a source of knowledge and instruction and quiet authority. She looked at the person behind all of that. A woman who had spent 40 years becoming capable because once when it mattered she had not been capable enough. A woman who had converted grief into competence and carried both of them unset down through 4 decades in one December night in the mountains of Western Virginia. She reached across and took Agnes's hand. Agnes looked at their hands together, the old weathered knowing hands and the young calloused learning ones, and something in her face eased. Not resolved, eased, the way long-held tension eases when something has finally been said. Outside, the sun was moving west. The shadows of the terrace gardens fell long across the cliff face. The sheep were grazing near the cave entrance, and Copper was making his precise, serious circuits around them. And from where Mara sat with the fire warm behind her, and Agnes's hand in hers, she could see all the way down the valley to where the tree line broke, and the open land began. Somewhere down there, Dale Varner was still following her father's maps. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She had that long. She looked at the terrace gardens, at the cabin walls behind her, at the rows of clay pots drying on the ledge, each one a week's worth of provisions in trading value, each one made by hands that had not known how to make them 8 months ago. She thought about Agnes's words from the night she had refused to sell to the settlement families. The day your anger decides who deserves what you make, you are not free. She thought about Holt walking through the woods for 2 months with a bag of medicine, looking for the right moment to cross the water. Some things are not resolved in a single night. Some things take the pressure of circumstances larger than the person to move them from where they've been sitting. Mara Calloway was 17 years old. She had built a house inside a mountain. She had learned to make things from clay and wood and whatever the forest offered. She had kept an old woman alive through a December that should have taken them both. She was not the girl who had sat in that kitchen drawing drainage diagrams. She was something that girl had been becoming without knowing it for a long time. Outside, the afternoon moved toward evening. The light on the creek turned gold. A wind came down from the ridge, carrying the smell of approaching autumn leaves beginning their long change, the first suggestion of what was building to the west. October was coming, and with October something else, something that would make every decision she had made in this cave feel small by comparison to the one that was coming. October arrived the way bad news arrives, quietly at first, then all at once. The last week of the month had been still and dry, the kind of stillness that isn't restful but watchful, the kind that makes animals move differently and makes the skin on the back of your neck register something your eyes haven't found yet. Mara had noticed it in Copper first. He had been staying closer than usual, not ranging ahead on the morning foraging runs, but pressing against her leg, his nose working the air with a focused intensity that was different from his ordinary curiosity. She noticed it in the creek next. The water level, already low from the summer drought, had dropped another inch overnight. The exposed stones along the bank were bone dry and pale. The falls behind her were a narrow veil of white against dark rock, almost transparent in certain lights, the thinnest she had seen them in all the months she had lived behind them. She noticed it in the sky last on the evening of October 28th. She had come out to check the terrace gardens moving along the cliff ledge in the last light of the afternoon, testing the soil and checking the potato greens that still had another week before they'd be ready to pull. She straightened up and looked west, and what she saw stopped her completely. The blue was gone. In its place, spreading from the horizon inward like a bruise expanding from a wound, was a purple so dark it was almost brown, the color of something that had been holding an enormous pressure for a long time and had finally reached its limit. The clouds were not the ordinary clouds of autumn weather. They were architectural, built-in layers towering in the west with a mass that seemed impossible for something made of vapor and water. They moved with a purpose that ordinary clouds don't have. The wind shifted. It had been coming from the southwest for weeks. Now it turned and came from the west, and it brought with it a smell she had known since childhood, a smell that lived in the gap between sensation and language, that combination of wet metal and something electrical that meant violence gathering in the atmosphere. She went back inside. Agnes was at the table, hands around a cup of tea. Copper already at her feet with his ears pricked and his body arranged in the posture he used when he was paying attention to something beyond the range of human senses. "Big storm," Mara said. Agnes looked at her, then at the rows of clay pots along the cave wall, then back at Mara. In the old woman's eyes was a question they both already knew the answer to. Not whether the storm was coming, not whether it would be serious, but the other question, the one that lived beneath the practical questions, the one that had been sitting in the corner of the cave for months waiting for the right moment to step forward. What kind of person are you going to be when this is over? Neither of them answered it. Not yet. Mara spent the rest of that evening moving. She worked by firelight and by the pale flickering illumination from the falls outside, which had already begun to thicken as the first outer bands of the storm moved in. Everything perishable went to the highest shelves inside the cabin. The food stores dried corn, smoked venison, potatoes still firm from their curing, jars of preserved beans sealed with rendered fat. She stacked and restacked until she was satisfied they were above any water line she could reasonably imagine. The hens went into the cabin in their crate balanced on the table, protesting this arrangement with the sustained indignation that hens reserve for situations beneath their dignity. The sheep she brought into the main cave chamber, where they clustered in the back with the resigned patience of animals that have accepted that humans will do inexplicable things and that tolerance is the most efficient response. Agnes helped where she could, passing clay pots hand to hand, steadying the crates, her grip steady, even if her breath was short. They didn't speak much. There was too much to do, and the work itself was a kind of conversation. The first drops of rain hit the stone outside like thrown gravel. Within an hour, it was no longer rain. It was something else, a sustained downward pressure, as if the sky had been holding the accumulated weight of every dry day since June in its fists, and had finally opened them all at once. The sound of it on the cliff face above them was a continuous roar that layered itself beneath the sound of the falls, until the two became indistinguishable, a single enormous noise that vibrated through the rock and up through the soles of their feet. Mara stood at the cave entrance and watched Millstone Falls transform. The thin veil it had become through the drought began to thicken. Within 2 hours it had doubled. By midnight it was a solid wall. Again, the falls she had known in January and February, the falls she had pushed Agnes through on a December night 10 months ago. By the second morning it was heavier than she had ever seen it. The roar had dropped an octave into something she felt more than heard, a vibration that lived in the chest cavity. The light that filtered through the curtain changed too. The clean green glow of ordinary days became something darker and more turbulent, a churning brownish green that shifted constantly, painted by the debris-laden water above. The cave felt different in that light, older, more serious. On the second night, the water came in. Not into the main chamber. The cave sat high enough on the cliff face that the central space remained dry. But the entrance ledge, the wide flat stone where Mara built her outdoor fire in fair weather, disappeared under 4 inches of brown water that pushed through the base of the fall's curtain and spread across the rock in a thin, persistent sheet. It lapped at the threshold of the main chamber with a sound like something patient, tasting the edge of what it wanted. Mara stood and watched it and made the necessary calculations. The water was rising, slowly but consistently. She had a margin. She did not know how much. She was in the middle of reorganizing the top shelf of the cabin for the second time when she heard it. At first she thought it was a sound from the storm, some new configuration of water and stone producing a new effect. But it came again, and it was directional. It was coming from the back of the cave, from the narrow passage that she had never been able to fit through, the one that ran back into the rock and disappeared. A knock. 3 knocks, in fact, deliberate, spaced. Mara went absolutely still. Copper had heard it too. He was facing the back of the cave, his body rigid, not growling, but focused in the way he focused on things he was trying to classify. 3 more knocks. Mara took the axe from beside the cabin door and walked toward the back of the cave. The passage entrance was barely 2 feet wide at its broadest point, narrowing as it went. She had never tried to go through it. She had assumed nothing larger than a fox could navigate it. She had been wrong about that. A hand appeared first, small, scraped raw along the knuckles, gripping the edge of the passage entrance and pulling. Then a shoulder. Then Rowena Varner came through the gap in the rock face with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who has been crawling in the dark for a very long time. She was soaked through. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that had been bleeding and had dried in a dark line down her temple. Her braid was entirely undone, her hair plastered flat. She sat on the cave floor and looked up at Mara with eyes that were exhausted past the point of hiding anything. "He's behind me," she said. "He can't get through on his own, his leg." Mara looked at the passage entrance. She looked at Rowena. She looked at the axe in her own hand. "How bad?" she said. "The break is below the knee. He fell in the creek, the bank gave way, and he went down onto the rocks. I got him to the passage entrance, but I can't pull him the rest of the way through without help." Rowena's voice was steady, in the way that voices get steady when a person has been running on pure necessity for long enough that emotion has become a luxury they can't afford right now. "He's conscious. Barely." Mara set the axe down against the cave wall. She looked at Agnes. Agnes sat at the table with her tea watching. Her face was entirely still. She was not advising. She was not directing. She was doing what she had done on the first night in this cave when she had looked at Mara with the full trust of someone who had made a decision to follow another person's judgment and meant it completely. Mara got down on her hands and knees and went into the passage. It was dark and close and smelled of wet stone and something older. She moved by touch, feeling the walls narrow and then open slightly and then narrow again. About 15 feet in her hands found something that wasn't stone. Dale Varner was on his side, wedged in a section where the passage was slightly wider. He was large, a broad-shouldered man who had spent his entire adult life doing physical work, and getting him through the remaining length of passage was going to require a degree of cooperation from someone who was mostly unconscious. She got her hands under his arms. "Mr. Varner," her voice was even, "I need you to push with your good leg when I pull. Can you hear me?" A sound from him, not words, but something. "Push when I pull," she said again. She pulled. It took 8 minutes in a level of physical effort that she would feel in her shoulders for a week. But they came through, first Varner, then Mara behind him, emerging into the cave's firelight in a heap on the stone floor. Dale Varner lay on his back in the cave that Mara Calloway had built inside the mountain that his maps had led him to, and he was alive because his 16-year-old daughter had dragged him through the dark to the only dry ground for half a mile in any direction. Mara looked at his right leg. The break was below the knee, as Rowena had said. The bone had not come through the skin a mercy, but the displacement was clearly visible even through the wet trouser leg. A wrongness in the line of the shin that the eye registered immediately as something that should not be that shape. She looked up at Copper. Copper was lying beside Dale Varner with his chin on his paws, watching the man breathe. Blameless, uncomplicated, just warmth offered to whatever needed it. Mara went to the woodpile and selected 2 straight pieces, dry dense, close to the same length. She took her knife and cut strips from the outer layer of her own coat, the heavy wool one she had been wearing since December. She knelt beside Dale's leg and began to work. He came fully conscious about halfway through. His eyes opened and found her face, and she watched him understand where he was. Not all at once, but in stages, like a man walking out of deep water, and only gradually realizing how far from shore he came from. He looked at the cave walls, at the cabin she had built, at the fire, at the clay pots on the shelves, at Agnes sitting at the table watching him with the calm, direct attention of a woman who had seen a great many things in 70 years and had stopped being surprised by most of them. He looked back at Mara. She was tying off the last strip of wool around the splint firm, and even the way you tie something you want to hold. She didn't look up. He said nothing. She said nothing. The silence between them was not comfortable, and it was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who have just discovered that the world is arranged very differently than either of them had assumed, and who need a moment to let that rearrangement settle into something they can stand on. Dale Varner had spent the better part of a year following a dead man's maps to find a mineral deposit that would save his homestead, and in the process had frightened and hunted and threatened by proximity a 17-year-old girl who was already living inside the thing he was looking for. And now that girl was tying a splint on his broken leg with strips cut from her own coat. He closed his eyes.
Not from pain, though the pain was real and considerable, from something else.
The third morning brought the first sign that the flood had reached its peak. Mara knew it before she could see. It clearly knew it from the sound of the falls, which had shifted slightly in pitch, and from the behavior of the water on the entrance ledge, which had stopped rising and was holding at a depth that was manageable. She went to the cave entrance and looked out through the falls curtain. The valley below was gone. Where the forest had been, there was a brown inland sea. Its surface was broken by the crowns of half-submerged trees, and the dark, angular shapes of things that had been structures, fences, rooftops, the remnants of someone's barn wall spinning slowly in the current and moving downstream with a terrible patience. The trail Silas used was somewhere under 6 feet of water. The lower woods where Mara had gathered her first firewood in January were entirely submerged. The settlement sat on the floodplain. She had always known this, had noted it in the months of watching the terrain, had registered it as a piece of information that lived in the same part of her mind where her father's surveys lived. The settlement was directly in the path of everything the mountains were pouring down. She was looking at the far ridge when she saw the figure, a dark shape against the gray sky, moving with the stumbling gait of someone who has been walking for a very long time on difficult ground. The figure reached the ridgeline and stopped swaying slightly, and then raised both arms and began to wave them in wide, desperate arcs. Silas. He was too far away to hear, and the storm was too loud for shouting, but his hands were speaking clearly enough. He made the shape of a house with his fingers, a peaked roof formed by 2 hands meeting above his head. Then a rising motion with one flat palm. Water. Rising water. Then he brought his hand to his mouth and back. Hungry. Then he spread his arms wide, a gesture of emptiness. Everything gone. Then he pointed east, toward where the Varner homestead would be beyond the ridge, and shook his head slowly. Mara stood at the cave entrance and felt the information land in her body before her mind had finished processing it. The settlement was destroyed. 23 people, the families she had grown up knowing, the same families who had closed their doors in December, were stranded on whatever high ground remained with nothing to eat, and no shelter, and no idea what came next. And somewhere in the direction Silas had pointed, Rowena's homestead was underwater. She raised her hand to Silas. Wait. She turned back into the cave. Dale Varner was propped against the cabin wall with his splinted leg extended, awake and alert, in the careful way of a man managing significant pain, with the limited tool of stillness. Rowena sat beside him, her shoulder against his arm, her eyes on Mara. Agnes was already watching her from the table. Mara stood in the center of the cave and looked at the shelves. Food stores for 2 people for 6 months, maybe more. Dried corn, smoked venison, potatoes, preserved beans. Jars of rendered fat. Dried herbs in labeled clay containers. A year's worth of relentless labor converted into provisions stacked and sealed against exactly this kind of winter. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the December night when the kitchen door clicked shut. She thought about Holt's voice through the closing gap his daughter won't, and the Crutchfield curtain falling back into place. She thought about Agnes's words from the June night when she had refused to sell pottery to the settlement families. You are chained to every one of them, and that chain is heavier than any log you've dragged up that hill. She thought about Rowena in the passage, her knuckles scraped raw, her eyes exhausted past the point of hiding anything. She thought about Silas on the ridge, arms spread wide. She thought about the fact that she had been angry for 10 months, and that the anger had been real, and that it had kept her warm, and that she could feel even now how much easier it would be to stand here and let it keep being a reason. Some things are not resolved by thinking. They are resolved by the body moving before the mind can stop it. She picked up the first burlap sack and began to fill it. Agnes, she said, I need you to direct the packing." Agnes rose from the table without a word. She went through the falls first to rig the crossing. Silas had understood her signal and was waiting on the far ridge with a coil of rope he'd managed to bring with him. The gorge between them was 30 feet across above 40 feet of raging brown water that carried tree trunks and debris and moved with a violence that made the air above it hum. She had felled a young pine near the cliff edge, 8 axe strokes clean and fast, stripped it in 5 minutes, and lashed her longest rope to a heavy stone. The stone needed to clear 30 feet of gorge in high wind. The first throw fell short. The stone arced and dropped into the flood below and was gone in an instant. The second throw went wide, the wind taking it sideways before it crossed the midpoint. She stood on the cliff edge and looked at the gorge and breathed. She thought about the log on the slope in February, about standing in the mud at the bottom and looking at it lying exactly where it had started, and the sound she had made that had bounced off the ridge and come back diminished. Then picking up the axe and starting again. She put every pound of muscle 11 months of hard labor had built into the third throw. The stone sailed out over the water in a long arc, caught the wind and corrected for it instead of yielding to it, and crashed through the upper branches of a pine on the far side. Silas was moving before it stopped swinging, wrapping the rope around the trunk with the quick competence of a man who works with rope daily. The line went taut across the gorge. Mara tied her end to the base of the felled pine. She and Silas worked for the better part of an hour, sending sacks of food across on a sliding harness she rigged from rope and a forked branch. More than half of everything she had stored through the year, passing over 30 feet of floodwater on a rope stretched between 2 trees because the alternative was to watch people go hungry in the mud while she kept it in the dark. When the last sack was across, she gripped the rope with both hands and went herself. The rope sagged under her weight, bowing down until the spray from the churning water below hit her back like thrown ice. The wind came at her broadside, and the rope twisted and vibrated under the force of it, and her wet hands slipped on the fibers, caught, slipped again. She locked her jaw and pulled, hand over hand. Her shoulders sent signals she declined to receive. Her abdominal muscles clenched against the swinging motion of the rope below. She made the mistake of looking down. Once saw the brown chaos below the debris spinning, heard the grinding sound of stones rolling against each other underwater, transmitted up through the rope into her palms like a warning delivered through clenched teeth. She did not look down again. She pulled, she reached, she pulled again. Then Silas's hands were on her wrists, hauling her onto solid ground, and she was on the far ridge with her cheek against mud, and her arms shaking and her palms burned raw by the rope. Copper came after her. He had wrapped his front paws around the rope and moved hand over paw along it with an expression of intense personal displeasure at the entire situation. When he reached solid ground, he shook himself with the full commitment of an animal that has something to prove, spraying Mara with water in every direction, and then licked her face with a thoroughness that suggested she had been gone too long. Silas looked at the sacks of food piled beside them. He looked at Mara, then back at the sacks. "There's more," Mara said. She was already on her feet. "Send the empty sacks over. I'll fill them again." They made 4 crossings in total before Mara calculated that they had taken all they could without leaving Agnes and the Varners with nothing. Then she and Silas descended the far side of the ridge toward whatever was left of the settlement. What was left was a muddy hilltop and the hollow-eyed faces of 23 people who had lost everything except the fact of their own survival. The settlement was gone. Not damaged, gone. The flood had not merely filled the houses and retreated, it had disassembled them. The structures her neighbors had built and maintained for decades had been lifted and carried and distributed across 3 miles of valley floor in pieces that bore no clear relationship to what they had once been. What remained was a cluster of families on the only high ground the floodplain offered, wrapped in whatever they had been wearing when the water rose, surrounded by mud with nothing to eat, and no clear idea of what came next. Mara walked into the camp with Silas behind her, each of them carrying a loaded sack. Copper trotted at her heels, 23 faces turned toward them. She recognized them all, had known them her entire life, the Crutchfields. Horace and his wife Prudence, 3 children ranging from 4 to 11. The Whitfields, the Harmons, the Dews. Old Cora Finch, 75 years old, sitting on a salvaged crate, with the composure of a woman who has outlasted too many catastrophes to be undone by one more. And Gideon Holt. He stood near the center of the group. His coat was gone. His white shirt was stained the same brown as everything else. His shoes were missing. He was 58 years old, and he looked every year of it, but he held himself with the reflex of a man whose posture has been his authority for 3 decades, even when everything else that backed the authority was gone. He saw Mara coming, and she watched the recognition move across his face in stages: confusion first, then understanding, then something that started as shame and collapsed into something more complex and harder to name. He was seeing the girl he had turned away from his door in December. He was seeing her walking toward him carrying food. He straightened his back, reached for something that had worked for 30 years. "Let me organize the distribution. I can ensure." "Children first," Mara said. She said it quietly, without anger, without the satisfaction that anger might have lent it. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather, and she walked past him and opened the first sack. Holt stood where she had left him. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He closed it. Mara knelt in the mud beside the Crutchfield children, 3 small faces looking up at her with the enormous eyes of the genuinely hungry, and placed a potato in each of their hands. She moved through the group with the efficiency of someone who has been planning logistics for 11 months, pressing food into trembling hands, asking in a low voice whether anyone was injured, noting the answers. She did not lecture. She did not explain herself. She did not make anyone look at what was being done to them, or what it should cost them. Halfway through, Prudence Crutchfield stepped forward. Her voice had the edge of a woman whose pride was the last thing the flood hadn't taken. "You're doing this so we'll owe you, aren't you?" The hillside went quiet. People stopped moving. Children looked up. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Mara felt the words land. She felt the full force of the impulse to respond to them, to say everything that 10 months of justified anger had prepared her to say, to account for every closed curtain and every recalculated conscience and every sermon preached in her absence about the wages of idleness. She had the words. She had earned the right to them. Before she could speak, a voice cut across the hillside like an axe through green wood. "Shut your mouth, Prudence Crutchfield." Cora Finch had not risen from her crate. She sat exactly where she had been, both hands on her knees, her white hair plastered flat, her 75-year-old face carrying the absolute authority of a woman who has been right about too many things for too long to be intimidated by the arithmetic of other people's shame. "This girl carried food across a flooding gorge to feed your children while you stand in the mud questioning why." Cora's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. She grew that food, she preserved it, she built the place it was stored in with her own 2 hands after you watched her walk into a December storm with nothing. She paused. "I told you people, I told you the Callaways don't quit and they don't die easy. Not one of you listened, but I am looking at the proof of it right now." She turned to Mara. "I told them," she said, "and I am grateful. And I am sorry it took this long for it to mean something to the people who needed to hear it." She reached out and took Mara's hand. It was the first time anyone from the settlement had touched Mara with kindness since December. A small thing, but the small things are what the large things are made of. Mara looked at Prudence Crutchfield. She saw the shame beneath the accusation, the fear beneath the pride, the last standing wall quality of a woman whose dignity had survived the flood by not having anywhere left to put down. "I did it because the children were hungry," Mara said. She turned back to the work. Gideon Holt found her the following morning. She was driving survey stakes into the mud on the high ground above the old settlement site, marking foundations, measuring gradients, beginning the work of designing where the new structures would go. She had been at it since before dawn. Copper was asleep in a patch of weak October sunlight nearby, having decided his services were not required for stake driving. She heard Holt's footsteps before she saw him. She recognized the sound, not the pulpit stride she had known all her life, but something slower, without the practiced authority in the heel strike. He stopped a few feet away and waited until she looked up. When she did, she saw that he had been carrying something with him for a long time that had nothing to do with the medicine bag. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed something so many times that the rehearsal has worn down the words to something simpler and truer than what he started with. "I told my congregation that your suffering was God's lesson," he said. "I stood in front of 40 people and told them that what happened to you and your grandmother was divine punishment for idleness." He stopped. His throat worked. "And I closed my door on a 70-year-old woman who was coughing in the rain because I had calculated that the cost of compassion was higher than the cost of inconvenience." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong. Not just that night. I have been wrong about this family for a long time, and I knew it, and I preached around it anyway." Mara looked at him. She thought about December, about the warmth that had reached through his open door for a moment and then withdrawn, about the voice through the closing gap, about the sermon she had heard about secondhand through Silas's careful, reluctant words, about the medicine bag he had carried for 2 months through the woods, looking for a moment to cross the water. "You carried medicine for 2 months," she said, "before you brought it." Holt absorbed this without flinching. "Yes." "Why so long?" "Because," he said, and then stopped and started again. "Because acknowledging a wrong to yourself and acknowledging it to the person you wronged are 2 different actions, and the second one requires you to give up something the first one lets you keep." She looked at him for a long moment, then she pushed a survey stake into his hands. "Then drive this one 12 feet north of that marker," she said. "The drainage has to angle away from the foundation or the spring melt will undermine it." Holt looked at the stake, then at the marker. He looked back at her. 12 feet north," she said. "The grade drops toward the creek from there. It'll carry the water away from the structure instead of toward it." He walked 12 feet north and drove the stake. He did not ask where to put the next one. He looked at the pattern of the stakes already in the ground, read the logic of it, the same way his father had read the logic of a page of scripture, following the structure until the meaning became clear, and drove the next stake where it needed to go. They worked through the morning without speaking much. At one point, one of the Crutchfield children ran over and asked who had designed the new layout. Holt looked down at the child, then up at the pattern of stakes spread across the muddy hillside. "Her father taught her some of it," he said. "She figured out the rest herself." He did not look up from what he was doing when he said it. It was the truest sentence he had spoken in 30 years of ministry, and it cost him more than any sermon. She found Harriet Calloway in the late afternoon. Her stepmother was sitting at the edge of the camp, apart from the others, on a patch of mud that was indistinguishable from every other patch of mud on the hillside. The good wool dress she had worn to church every Sunday for as long as Mara could remember was ruined in a way that put it past any future usefulness. Her hair hung in ropes. She was not looking at the food being distributed or at the people around her or at the work being organized on the high ground. She was looking at Mara. Their eyes met. Mara walked over. She did not speak first. She sat down in the mud beside Harriet and held out a potato. Harriet took it. Her fingers were cold and thin, and they shook as they closed around the rough skin. She held it but did not eat it. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something that has come to you from a direction you didn't expect from a hand you told yourself you had a right to close. Then her shoulders began to tremble. "I should never have sent you away." Her voice came out as barely a whisper, not the flat, decided voice of the kitchen, but something raw and stripped, the sound of a wall that has been holding back pressure for a long time, and has finally run out of reasons to keep holding. "I know that. I knew it the morning after. I have known it every day since December." Mara said nothing. "I sent you out because every time I looked at you, I saw him. And I had spent 14 months telling myself that what I felt was practicality, that I was managing a farm and making sensible decisions, and that the arrangement I had chosen was exactly what I had expected it to be." Harriet stopped. Her jaw worked. "But it wasn't practicality. It was I was ashamed of how much I had wanted something he was never able to give me. And you were proof of it just by existing. By tilting your head the way he did. By reaching for a pencil before anything else." The tears ran down her face, cutting tracks through the mud. "I punished you for being his daughter, and I was wrong." Mara sat with this. She looked at the valley below them, the brown inland sea, the debris moving in slow arcs, the shape of a world rearranged by forces larger than any of the choices that had been made in it. She thought about Edmund Calloway sitting in his chair reading aloud, and the plans he sketched on every available surface, and the cave he had found and mapped and left as an inheritance for a daughter he knew would need it. She thought about the way he had loved problems more than people, the kindness of it and the cost of it, and the way both things could be true at the same time. "Father loved what he was solving," she said quietly. "Maybe he didn't know how to love people in the way they needed to be loved. Maybe that wasn't his gift." She paused. "But he took me to a waterfall when I was 9 years old and told me to listen for the hollow sound, and that is the only reason I'm alive." Harriet looked at her. Something passed between them that had no single name. Not forgiveness. It was too soon, and some things don't compress into a single moment no matter how much pressure the moment applies. But something. An acknowledgement that they had both been shaped by the same man, and that the shaping had cost them both something real, and that perhaps the reckoning with that cost did not have to be a solitary exercise. They sat together in the mud for a long time. The distance between them, though still present, was no longer a void. It was a bridge being built from both ends simultaneously by two people who had not yet met in the middle, but who had both finally agreed on the direction. The floodwaters receded. The mud dried to a crust that cracked in the November sun, then dried further to something solid underfoot. The debris line marked on the hillside like a bathtub ring showed exactly how high the water had risen, and confirmed what Mara's survey stakes already indicated: the old settlement site was uninhabitable. The foundations of the old houses had been compromised, not just by the water itself, but by the saturation of the ground beneath them. Building there again would be building on borrowed time. The new site was on the high ground. Mara worked from the survey stakes outward, drawing the full plan for the new settlement, the way Edmund would have drawn it on paper, with precise measurements and notations in the margins, with drainage channels calculated for the maximum rainfall the mountains could produce. She worked in the evenings by firelight, and during the days she was on the hillside with the others, driving stakes and moving stone and showing anyone who was willing to learn the difference between a foundation that would hold and one that would eventually fail. Dale Varner, hobbling on a crutch Rowena had fashioned from a forked branch, began appearing at the building site in the second week. He did not announce himself. He did not explain himself. He picked up a stone from the pile of cleared rock and carried it to where it was needed, and then went back for another one, his jaw set against the pain in his leg and his eyes on the work. He never apologized to Mara. That was not the kind of man he was, and she had known enough men of that kind to understand that waiting for the apology would be a longer wait than the thing was worth. But on the third day he appeared at the building site, she noticed that he had stopped letting his bad leg slow him down as much as it had. He was working it, pressing through the pain with the focused stubbornness of a man who has decided that a certain calibration of discomfort is the correct price for being present. On the fifth day, as they were working side by side to level the foundation stone for the first new structure, he said, to no one in particular, his eyes on the stone, he was setting his voice, the quiet, flat voice of a man reporting a fact. She went through the passage in the dark, in a flood, to bring me through. He paused. A man doesn't forget that. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Rowena came to Mara on the last day of October with a question she had been carrying for a while. My father says I can learn, she said, if you'll teach me. She meant the pottery. She meant the clay and the fire and the hands learning to read the material. She meant everything that Agnes had given to Mara through the dark months in the cave, the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had converted grief into competence and carried both without setting either one down. Mara looked at Rowena's hands, at the healing bruise on her forearm, at the eyes that were older than 16 and had been older than 16 for longer than they should have been. Come tomorrow, she said. I'll teach you the pinch method. It's how I learned. Rowena nodded, and when she turned to go, Mara saw Agnes watching from the cave entrance, the old woman's face soft with something that looked like the particular piece of a person who has finally been able to put something down that they have been carrying for a very long time. That evening, Mara asked her about it. Agnes looked at Rowena's retreating figure for a moment. She reminds me of someone, Agnes said. Who? Agnes didn't answer directly. She looked at Mara with eyes that held 40 years of sorrow and 40 years of making up for it, layered together into something that was neither one nor the other, but both simultaneously. Someone I lost, she said. Someone I have been trying to save ever since. Louisa, the sister her mother had never known. The daughter Agnes had lost to her own ignorance on a Tuesday morning in November 1833. The ghost that had driven an old woman to learn everything she could learn to make herself capable of anything the world might require so that she would never again stand helpless in front of something she might have prevented. Rowena was not Louisa. Nothing could bring Louisa back. But teaching Rowena was not replacement. It was continuation. A thread picked up from where it had been dropped and carried forward through different hands in a different time, still moving in the same direction. 5 years passed the way years pass when they are full of work. The settlement rebuilt itself on the high ground above the old site. 12 cabins stood where the flood had never reached their foundations deep, and their drainage channels angled away from the walls in the precise configuration that Mara had calculated on a piece of paper by firelight in November of 1871. The church was rebuilt too smaller than the old one, simpler, set at the edge of the new settlement with a view down into the valley. Gideon Holt still preached from it every Sunday. The sermons were different now. Not in their structure. He still had the cadence of a man who had spent 30 years learning to make words carry weight. But the content had shifted the way a river shifts its course over time, not in a single dramatic event, but in the accumulated pressure of many small redirections. He preached less about punishment and more about what people owe each other in the dark. He had the sound of a man who has learned something he cannot unlearn and is still in the process of discovering what it means for everything else he thought he knew. Rowena Varner opened a pottery workshop in 1876 in a small building near the new church. She had 3 apprentices working with her by the following year, learning the pinch method, learning to read the clay, learning to create objects that would outlast the day of their making. Every spring she walked up the ridge to the cave behind Millstone Falls and left a bowl she had made on the grave of Agnes Calloway, who lay on the hillside above the water in a spot where the sound of the falls was clear and constant. The headstone was simple. Mara had chosen the words herself. She knew everything she needed to know and paid dearly to learn it. Copper lay beside her in the autumn of 1876. He had been 14 years old, which is a long life for a dog and a complete one by any measure. He went in a patch of afternoon sunlight near the cave entrance quietly and without complaint, the way he had lived. Mara buried him on the ridge beside Agnes and marked his grave with a flat stone. She carved into it the only words that seemed adequate. He stayed. On a cool evening in the late autumn of 1876, Mara Calloway stood on the rock ledge at the mouth of her cave and looked out over the valley. She was 23 years old. Her hair was the same dark brown it had always been, but her hands were different, weathered and capable in a way that hands become when they have been used consistently for real work over a long period of time. Her eyes were still the eyes of someone who looks at the world as a series of problems worth solving. She had not stopped being that. She had stopped believing it was a liability. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the 12 houses on the high ground below. Rowena's workshop added its own thread to the gray tapestry of the sky. The creek below was running at its ordinary level, neither the drought-thin trickle of that terrible August, nor the violent flood of October 1871, but something in between, something that belonged to the valley and moved through it with the ease of long familiarity. Millstone Falls fell behind her. She had lived with this sound for 6 years. She had woken to it and worked to it and thought to it and grieved to it and made decisions by it, until it had become something she heard the way you hear your own heartbeat, always present, never notice the rhythm against which everything else is measured. She took the folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She had carried it there every day since the night Agnes had shown it to her 11 months after Edmund had written it, and before he had the chance to explain it himself. The paper was soft at the folds now, worn to the texture of cloth. At the creases, the pencil lines faded but still legible. She looked at his handwriting. Our insurance policy. Tell Mara when she's ready. She'll hear it before she sees it. He had been right about all of it. Right about the cave. Right about the hearing before the seeing. Right about what she would need and when she would need it. He had loved problems more than people she understood that now, in a way she hadn't at 17 understood it without the anger that had once surrounded the understanding. Because she also knew that it was the same quality in a different register that had made him map this hillside and prepare this escape and trust his daughter to find it when the time came. He had loved her the way he knew how to love things, by solving for them, by preparing the ground before the need arrived. She folded the paper and put it back against her chest. Behind her from inside the cave she could hear the sound of Rowena's daughter, 8 years old, already curious about clay, asking questions that Agnes would have recognized about why the walls had to be even, about what happened when you pressed too hard, about how you knew when the thing in your hands was finished. And from inside the voice of someone answering, patient, precise, passing something forward. The fire was warm. The door of the cabin she had built with her own hands stood open. Mara turned and walked back through the water into the light. Hollow, her father's word. The word she had spent 6 years learning the full meaning of. Not the sound of emptiness, the sound of room. Room for fire. Room for a table. Room for 2 women and a dog, and then more people, more seasons, more of the slow work of building something that outlasts the day of its making. Room for anger that burns clean when you finally let it find its right proportion. Room for forgiveness that arrives not as a word, but as a hand picking up the other end of a log and driving a stake into the right place and carrying a stone from where it is to where it needs to be. Room for a man who loved problems to leave behind something more lasting than any structure he built with his hands, the shape of a mind given to his daughter, and through her to everyone she taught, and through them to everyone they would teach in turn. The waterfall fell. The valley held its smoke and its light. And the sound behind the sound, the hollow sound, the sound her father had heard 30 years before she was born and had been trying to tell her about ever since, continued as it always had, as it always would. Patient, constant, full,